Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This conference is part of the 25th anniversary celebrations of the founding of the Armenian Research Center at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. We will be having a series of events during the year, but this is, of course, the major weekend. Other events will be probably on weekdays during the coming months until the end of this academic year. And at the start of this conference, I'm very glad that the Dean of the College of Arts and Science and Letters at the university, Professor Gerald Hale, has kindly agreed to come and extend a word of welcome to you, the audience who have decided to come and join us on this, for us, very joyous occasion.
Thank you very much. I'm doing triple duty tonight, and I just left the University of Michigan Dearborn's Alumni Awards event. I was afraid I was going to be a few minutes late. The award that I was presenting was one of the last. I am very pleased to be here. Unfortunately, when I finish my remarks, I've got to run off to another event on campus as well. And I think what that does is it shows me how many exciting things are happening here at the University of Michigan Dearborn. None of which, though, I think is more exciting than the event that you're going to be taking part of this weekend. It is the distinct pleasure of the University of Michigan Dearborn and the College of Arts, Sciences, and Letters to welcome you to this international conference marking the 25th anniversary of the Armenian Research Center. This occasion is especially significant for several reasons. First, the 25th anniversary of the Armenian Research Center demonstrates that the vision of Professor Denis Papazian for a center about learning about Armenian history and culture, and his vision to create an archive of related documents for students and scholars was an extraordinary one. It was a vision with historical, cultural, and scholarly value, and it had remarkable impact and remarkable staying power. It is a testament to Professor Ara Sanjian and his stewardship for the center. The center now includes an archive of more than 18,000 volumes, publishes books related to Armenian history and culture, and has sponsored book exchanges with other libraries. The center was the first such institution of its kind at an American university and served as an impetus for expanding curricula and creating endowed chairs related to Armenian studies at other universities. In that sense, the impact of this center is that it has had an important heuristic effect on Armenian studies nationally. Second, this occasion is an important one because it is a testimony to the important academic strides made at the University of Michigan Dearborn. The university offers coursework in Armenian language, history, and culture to our students. The courses are taught regularly and are important parts of our curricula. Understanding Armenian history has an impact that goes beyond studying a single country or people. To understand Armenians and the Armenian diaspora necessarily requires an understanding of world history, ancient and modern. So the strides that have been made here at the University of Michigan Dearborn have helped our students have a greater understanding of a complex world and the role that Armenia and Armenians have made and have had in it. Third, this occasion is important because it is another in a series of events that highlights the role of the center in the region. The University of Michigan Dearborn is a campus with a metropolitan vision, a mission to have an impact on southwestern Ontario, southeastern Michigan, and the world. The Armenian Research Center is an important element of that metropolitan vision for the university. According to the 2000 census, there were 12,000 Armenians and Armenian Americans living in metropolitan Detroit. That population is considerably larger now, even though the state's population is declining. The center has hosted a number of cultural events over its 25-year history to reach out to and embrace Detroit's diverse population. It participated in humanitarian missions, such as serving as a depository for relief supplies after the 1988 Armenian earthquake, and again in the winter of 1992 and 1993 with the Operation Winter Rescue in conjunction with the United States State Department. The center is truly engaged in the metropolitan area, and to me that's especially significant. Fourth, This is an important occasion because it brings together 9 prominent international scholars and meeting participants from around the country and around the world. It's the first conference to focus on diaspora, Armenia, and linkages of the two across 3 governments, the first Republic of Armenia, Soviet Armenia, and post-Soviet Armenia. In this way, the conference will do what the Center has always done and has done in many other respects. It will break new ground with regard to Armenian studies. To our distinguished guests and our conference participants, let me say that we are extremely proud of the Center, and we are elated that you can be here to celebrate its 25th anniversary. We are pleased that our university, students, and community can benefit from the expertise, the wisdom, and the scholarship that will be presented here over the weekend and throughout the year. I hope that you all have a wonderful time in Dearborn and a wonderful visit to the University of Michigan Dearborn and to the Center. I'm confident that your visit will be professionally, socially, and intellectually rewarding. Welcome, and I hope this is an event that you find to be of incredible value as we do the Armenian Research Center. Thank you.
When we were discussing the idea of what topic to have for our inaugural conference, the Armenian Research Center has done a lot of things over the past 25 years, but this is the first time that plans to have a conference have materialized. I know that under Professor Babayan, a number of conferences were being planned, etc., but to some extent, we could, for some reason, did not actually happen. So we're breaking new ground here, and it really will depend upon how successful this event is, so that we may repeat it then gradually in the coming years as well, hopefully. The whole idea is that although a number of books have been published on Armenia-diaspora relations, actually more in Armenia than in diaspora, they have usually dwelt on with very broad aspects of the development. The idea was that instead of making a broad history, let's put together 9 case studies. And let's see, if we look at this history at the micro level, what kind of new questions will come for historians and other social science experts to dwell on in the future. And in order to make it even more focused, we said, okay, either the participants have to pick an individual, or they have to pick an organization or a government department in Armenia, and then we'll try to tell the story from the viewpoint of that individual or the viewpoint of that organization. And in that sense, there are a variety of approaches and a number of themes that will be tackled. Technically, of course, like every other conference, this was a little bit of a hassle to organize, and for us, as I said, it was to some extent a new experience. And it was during the preparation of this conference that I finally realized what Murphy's Law was, that if anything can go wrong, it will go wrong. But in the end, we still have a conference which will be as exciting as the one we planned. But we will not be having all the speakers here. 2 of them are absent because of illness. And the wife is absent because she has to look after the husband who is sick. So my advice to people who are organizing conferences, don't invite husband and wife. From now on, the chances of losing 2 participants is higher than 1. The other is unfortunately US government, because one of our participants was denied the visa. And when we even appealed to the consulate in Yerevan, within 24 hours, it was again a no thing. But at least we have the paper of that person. And he's so sorry that he could not be with us. He was looking forward to being with us. He extends you his greetings. And we had planned that he will deliver his paper in Armenian, and there will be a simultaneous English translation. Now that he's not here, we have agreed, of course, in consultation with Professor Bardakyan, who is chairing the first session, that I will simply read the English translation, which is the full English translation of his paper. He will not be here, but we will have a discussion on the paper. Because basically we are going to keep you informed of what has been, because in the end of the conference comes the book. And for us, a book is as important, let's say coming out within 2 years maybe, and even those who are absent today are committed to the project of the book in that sense. We are replacing one of the papers tomorrow with a discussion. And we had initially planned a 1-hour discussion at the end of the conference on issues of sources, theory, and methodology. The participants have decided to extend that into anything between 1.5 hours and 2 hours because they want to dwell on. So tomorrow there will also be a discussion mainly led by the scholars, but of course those who are also guests of this conference can also share with us their viewpoints and their expectations. So overall, this is in general what we are going to do in the coming day, in the next 24 hours over a 2-day period. And now it's, I think, the time for me to invite Professor Kevork Bardakjian, Marie Manukyan Professor of Armenian Language and Literature at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, who has kindly agreed to chair today's the first panel. I'm sure most of you already know that currently he is also the president of the Society of Armenian Studies, and the Dearborn campus has a long history of being associated with the SAS, starting with Professor Papazian, who has even been president at one time, and myself, who also served on the executive committee during my tenure here. And for many years, not now, but for many years, the SAS journal was edited and published here. Gerald Autumnbright, in his own free time, still continues to work with the SAS journal as well. So in that case, we're very happy that we have the SAS president with us here as well. Towards the end of the session, of course, I'll come and give you more information about tomorrow's events. But now let us now start with the first session. Professor Bardakjian.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased and honored to be here on this auspicious occasion, the 25th anniversary of the Armenian Research Center, and especially when its founder is gracing us with his presence here. I don't see him, but he's usually very visible. Right here. I'll be running the first session. I was asked to say a few words about the context of this first panel, especially for Professor Sanjian's students. How to look at these three papers, one of which was not sent actually. So we have 2 papers for this panel. They both deal, of course, with the larger theme of the diaspora-Armenia relations. The first one deals with the attitude, position of the Armenians of Istanbul, basically. This is post-genocide Istanbul, but still under occupation when the first Armenian Republic came into existence from 1918 to 1920 for about 30 months. And then, of course, the republic became a Soviet republic and part of the Transcaucasian Federation, etc., and then part of the USSR Soviet when the new constitution was drafted in 1936. So the Armenians at this period are going through a phase, a very difficult phase. This is the post-genocide phase. There is a republic finally after 600 years or so of the collapse of political structures in Armenia. In the Far East, it is very interesting to study the reactions and attitudes of Western Armenians, especially those stationed in Constantinople or Istanbul by now. How they felt, how they reflected on the new nascent Armenian Republic. And there are some very interesting, unexpected sort of reactions that is not my job to go into those now. But today's first speaker Dr. Lerna Ekmekçioğlu, who's a visiting academic with us on Ann Arbor campus, will deal with the attitudes of Armenian Constantinopolitans towards the First Republic during this period until the final and formal dissolution of the Ottoman Empire by Kemal Mustafa Atatürk, and this ensuing, I think, a few years. This is one side of the story, that is the beyond the Republic. And then the second paper, which we have by an Armenian author from Armenia, deals with the first years of Soviet period and the preoccupation of the Soviet Armenian leadership with repatriation and other similar issues, showing to us that contrary to sometimes misinterpretations, these people, these communist leaders, if you will, were as good Armenians as many of us, and they were concerned with the fate of the country and the people. So this is the context. We are looking at these years in the life of Armenia and diaspora from about 1918 to the 50s or so, from two different, geographically speaking, two different points, Armenia proper itself and the diaspora. So it is my pleasure and distinct honor to invite our first speaker, Dr. Lerna Ekmekçioğlu.
During the Armenian genocide, when almost all Ottoman Armenians were being deported, killed, raped, kidnapped, and tortured, their counterparts in Istanbul continued their daily life as before. This doesn't mean that Armenians in Istanbul at the time of the genocide had lived an easy life. Most lived with a burning question: are we too going to be deported and even killed? They were in an unprecedented state of terror, really. So I will start my paper with giving a broad overview of how Bolsa Hais, that is Constantinopolitan Armenians, experienced the war years. I will then focus on the journal Haygin and its significance in exploring the broader context of Armenia-Istanbul relationships. In order to do that, I will highlight a few instances of interaction between Armenian representatives and the community in Istanbul during the 1822 period. So as I have already mentioned, in Istanbul in 1915, only certain groups were deported as part and parcel of the genocide. We already know that the case of the approximately 250 Armenian intellectuals and public leaders to be taken to police custody, deported, and then subsequently killed. Another group in Istanbul, which I don't think is getting enough academic attention, is who shared the same fate, was single Armenian men, originally from Kavars provinces, who at the time were working in Istanbul as laborers. They were also deported. In addition, Ottoman government sent the Armenian Patriarch Zavender Yeğeyan to exile and closed off the Armenian Patriarchate, so it wasn't functioning as usual during the war years. Until 1918, Constantinopolitan Armenians knew only little of the gigantic scale and systematic nature of the massacres in the provinces. During the war, Ottoman government censored the press, the entry of foreign periodicals to Istanbul was mostly banned, and non-Muslims were not allowed to travel. Moreover, communication between the Armenian Patriarchate, whoever was representing the Patriarchate at the time, and approximately 30 archdioceses and dioceses in the provinces were cut. In Istanbul, a number of Armenian intellectuals, especially members of the political parties, they went underground. Those who somehow were able to escape the night of April 24th or for various reasons, they went underground, had a secret life. But some others, unable to continue a proper daily life in the city, left for Haygırzi, Kınalıada, Proti, to which Armenians at the time frequently referred as Armenian Island because of its overwhelmingly Armenian population. Even though the island was traditionally used in the summer months, during the war years, many Armenian intellectuals stayed there, even during the winter, to quote, feel and breathe in a relative freedom. The grim mood of Armenians on the island suddenly changed on June 11, 1918, when a young man named Kirkor brought some good news to her mother, Zaruhi Bahri. At the time, Kirkor was working for a Turkish newspaper as a cartographer. On that sunny day in the summer of 1918, he happily informed his mother that the following day, the main headline of the newspaper for which she was working was going to read, "Sinek bir şey değil ama mide bulandırır." That is, "Cancı pammuçe, payt sirt gabıgdore." As my translation would be, it might be tiny, but a fly can give someone heartburns. So what did the fly refer to? Clearly, or maybe it's not clear, but he was very happy because the fly referred to the newly established independent sovereign Armenia in the Caucasus. Kirkor told his mom that day he tried everything to suppress his excitement in order not to show his Turkish colleagues his intense happiness. While drawing the map of Armenia for the newspaper, this Armenian guy working in a Turkish newspaper in 1918, still the war years, he had an urge to draw it a little larger, the map, but chose not to take such a risk, as he informs his mom. Hearing her son's words, Zaruhi broke into tears. For a while, she cried for her recent losses. Her brother, Parseh Shahbaz, a Dashnaktutyum member, was taken by Turkish police on April 24, 1915, and then killed. Her sister, along with her children who happened to be in the provinces at the time, were also killed or kidnapped. So the news of the establishment of the independent Armenia meant both a sort of mourning and revenge for her. If only, she cried, her brother, sister, and all other Armenian brothers and sisters were alive to celebrate the good news together. She immediately took it upon herself to organize a celebration ceremony that night in one of the hotels in the island. Kirkor spread the news among all Armenians of the island, who on the very evening did not fail to fill the hotel's reception hall to capacity. The elevated crowd, seeing their age-old dream finally come true, sang Hayastan Yergir Trakh Davayr all together. At the podium, leading the crowd, was Manik Berberyan, the daughter of Reteos Berberyan. She was colored in the colors of the Armenian flag, which Kirkor had informed her mom that day as being red, blue, and orange. Armenians of Istanbul further rejoiced when, in a few days' time, still in June in 1918, a delegation from Armenia, chaired by Avedis Aharonian, and including Alexander Hadisyan and Mikhail Papajanyan, arrived in Istanbul to pursue diplomatic relations with the Ottoman government and resolve some boundary issues. Together with Vartuhi Kalandaryan, Zaruhi Bahri, Kirkor's mom, managed to secure an appointment with Aharonian in the famous Tokatlian hotel where he was staying. Upon the request of her husband, a prominent lawyer who survived the night of April 24th because he happened to be abroad at the time, Zaruhi gave 50 golden liras to Aharonian in order for him to donate to a cause in Armenia as soon as he returns back home. The delegation stayed in Istanbul till November, when the terms of Mudros armistice were made known, bringing about yet another wave of jubilant mood amongst Armenians worldwide. The news of the Ottoman defeat, the favorable terms of Mudros armistice, signed in October 1918, and almost immediate occupation of Istanbul and Anatolia by victorious Allied powers, that is Britain, France, Italy, assured Armenians that it was the end of their nation's suffering and that the West came to their rescue. The period is usually referred to in the periodicals of the time and in the memoirs as the drunkenness, kinovutyan dariner. So they were really joyful that finally it was their salvation that they were experiencing. The occupation of Istanbul gave Bolsahais a newfound freedom of expression and association. In May 1919, the first anniversary of the establishment of the Armenian Republic was celebrated with great enthusiasm in the streets of Istanbul. in the streets of Istanbul, quote, where children held Armenian badges and many buildings were covered with Armenian flags. Armenian women displayed the Armenian flag in the best corners of their households, occupation years Istanbul. A number of shops in Pera hang French, British, and Armenian flags in their windows. A general feeling among Bostohais was that the foundation of their independent state was the ultimate revenge of the Armenian against the Turk, who had recently hoped to exterminate the Armenian altogether. Determined to work for the Armenian cause, Haytat, and to give rebirth to their nation, the Askain Verazunund, Armenians in Istanbul not only established numerous societies and organizations for political, social, philanthropic, and charity purposes, but they also published newspapers, weeklies, monthlies, and almanacs. From 1918 to 1922, 65 periodicals began publication only in Istanbul. Among them, however, only one survived, to my knowledge, this period without changing its name or editor. Haygin, Armenian woman, to which I devoted a significant time of years, really. This journal, the rest of the presentation will be based on Haygin. Of course, meaning Armenian woman, it started publication in Istanbul in November 1919, exactly 1 year after the signing of the Mudros Armistice. Hayganush Mark, born in Istanbul in 1884, founded the journal and continued to edit it until 1933, when the journal was closed down by the orders of the Turkish government. Haygin was a popular fortnightly publication that was read and continued by literate educated women and men from inside and outside of Turkish borders, especially in the pre-1923 period. During the vibrant years of 1919 to 1920, Haygin also attracted attention because it was the official publication of the Armenian Women's Association, Hayganans Ngerak Tutyon. Most members of the association, among them Zaruhi Bahri, were writers in Haygin. Supported by most of the leading Armenian female figures of the time and encouraged by the Armenian Patriarch Zaven himself, the Armenian Women's Association came into being in June 1919. Its goals, plans, and bylaws were published in the first issue of Haygin. The list concluded. So in the programs, we see like a lot of mention of care, orphan care, sick people's cares and everything. But at the end, italicized, bold, it is written, quote, taking into consideration the imperative demands of the present day, the immediate aim of our association is to defend the Armenian cause by the voice of the Armenian women, and together with the Armenian National Assembly to assist in the reconstruction of the mother fatherland, Mair Hayrenik. Indeed, this was the overall political agenda of Haygin until the autumn of 1922, when Kemalist Turkish troops entered the Greek-occupied Izmir, massacred Greeks, and then set the city on fire. Only a month after the Smyrna catastrophe, Turks entered Istanbul as well, causing panic amongst local Armenians and Greeks, among whom a significant portion, including Zaruhi Bahri and her family, fled the city. Those who stayed put turned to be Turkish Armenians as we understand them now. This is one of my arguments. The community turned inward, became silent, showed exaggerated forms of loyalty to the Turkish state and society, and did not write too much about Soviet Armenia. So understandably, they never referred to Soviet Armenia after this period. I guess I'm going to talk about it a little further later on. But they never, of course, referred to Soviet Armenia as a fatherland, as this would attract the negative attention of the Turkish state, already quite suspicious about the sincerity of the Armenian loyalty to the new modern Republic of Turkey. So returning back to Haygin before 1922, until 1922, in Haygin, along with recipes, needlework examples, rules of etiquette, and literary pieces, we also see significant space to be devoted to political commentary, especially about Hayastan, both as a Hayastan is in Armenia, both as a physical political entity and an idea and ideal as a homeland. Haygin Uşmark and many of the writers of Haygin took it upon themselves to mobilize Armenian women to work for the realization of the independent, united Greater Armenia, Miat-Yalanga Hayastan. The newly established Armenian Republic in Transcaucasia was frequently referred to as an infant or newborn. The tiny territory needed vast amounts of help. All post-war Turkish Armenian political parties, periodicals, intellectuals, and social workers were recruited for this goal. So it wasn't only about Haygin, this agenda of working for the independent Armenia. Armenia, the infant, Manuk Hayastan, was everyone's child, a precious little thing that was conceived after centuries of living under the Ottoman and Russian yoke. Armenian energy, as Haygin frequently argued, should be directed to collectively transforming this infant into the mother and motherland of all Armenians. The goal of turning infant Armenia to mother-fatherland necessitated every Armenian's active engagement with the common cause. Both male and female intellectuals and public leaders expected Armenian women to leave the comfort zone of their households and work for the nation. Women were expected to assure both traditional and non-traditional womenly responsibilities, including attending to the needs of refugees, deportees, orphans, and the sick who were sheltered in refugee camps, orphanages, hospitals, schools, and churches. Another overall goal was to marry off young orphan, especially orphan girls, often victims of sexual violence. And another goal was to make Armenian women and also men to contribute financially to the Armenian state. And for Armenian women as well, we see a promotion of them in engaging in propaganda work among elite officers, occupational forces, officers of the occupational forces in Istanbul at the time, with the hopes that they would support the cause of the establishment of Greater Armenia. So the Armenian intelligentsia, so this is a time period that the Paris Peace Conference is going on. And Armenian intelligentsia and political leaders in Istanbul were well aware that Armenian claims over an independent sovereign national state crucially depended on demographics as understood in the Wilsonian principle of self-determination. So repopulation in the post-genocide period was an act of revenge also. The Armenian national agenda required both local Constantinopolitans and refugee women to bear many children and take care of them, as Mair Hayrenik required not only diplomatic and military savvy, but also countless babies and children to technically repopulate the land. My research suggests that at the time, Haygin was considered to have a significant influence over Armenian women, if not among masses, definitely among middle and upper class educated Bolshevis. Indeed, twice in this period, representatives of Armenia, independent Armenia, who visited Istanbul, paid a visit to Haygin and to its editor, Haygin Uşmark, in order to ask the journal's support. In 1922, so I'm going to highlight two instances. This is the first one. In 1920, when Alexander Hadisyan, the former prime minister of the Armenian Republic, visited Istanbul for 5 days on his tour of diaspora communities to collect financial aid for the Republic of Armenia, he emphasized the inseparability of the well-being of Armenians in Istanbul and Armenian refugees who composed almost half of the population in the newly established Armenia. In this 1920 tour, only 2 months after his post as the Prime Minister of Armenia ended, Hadisyan asked Constantinopolitan Armenians for financial help to boost the dramatically worsening economy in Armenia and strengthening the Armenian military. The young republic was going through a particularly hard time, as half of the population, approximately 300,000 refugees from the empire, were starving. Moreover, as you know, there was epidemics killing a significant percent of the population. So in Istanbul, both Hadisyan and his campaign for an independence loan, Angahutyan Pokharinutun, were received quite warmly by Armenians. The editor of the Zhogovurtitsaina newspaper, a daily People's Voices, the editor he had an interview with him, Hadisyan, and he began his interview by emphasizing that even uttering the words of the former prime minister of the Armenian Republic was in and of itself a realization of a dream. In a rare gesture of unity, all four Armenian political parties active in Istanbul at the time, Khınçakyan, Azadagan, Tashnakçutun, and Ramgavar, publicized Hadisyan's call in their newspapers. During the same days, Zaruhi Bahri, who was still in Istanbul, wrote in the Jagadamart Daily a piece entitled "The Fatherland is in Danger," arguing that since Armenian sons outside of Armenia were not conscripted into the Armenian military, they should compensate financially. To set an example, she sent 100 golden liras to Armenia on behalf of her two sons, Kirkor and Jirai. As the leaders of the women's national activism in Istanbul, the Armenian Women's Association and Haigin were invited to meet with Alexander Hadisyan during his 1920 visit. Besides meeting with businessmen, so he had, in his program, he met with businessmen, religious leaders, and attorneys, basically asking for financial support. Hadisyan devoted his limited time to visit also with a group of Armenian women. This is the Haigin and the circles of the Armenian Women's Association, because he announced his belief that women should have a bigger share in his campaign. In his above-mentioned interview to the Zhogovurtitsaina Armenian Daily, Hadisyan mentioned that women of the Armenian communities in Batum and Tbilisi initiated a gold fund to which they donated their gold coins, rings, watches, necklaces, earrings, bracelets, and other jewelry. Hadisyan had to cut his Istanbul visit short, for he was called to Paris by the Armenian delegation, and he was not able to visit the Armenian Women's Association's headquarters, but still, association members, including Haigan Ushmark, had the opportunity to converse with him during his visit to the Armenian Surpigich Hospital in Yedikule. There, Hadisyan gave a talk about the necessity of a similar initiative by Constantinopolitan Armenian women. Encouraged by his words, some women gave him the jewelry that they had worn to the meeting on that same day during the same meeting. Additionally, an Armenian housemaid from Istanbul, Dikranohi Derminasyan, met with Hadisyan in the Armenian Patriarchate to offer her life savings totaling 50,000 francs to the campaign. Her donation was earmarked for the construction of a school in Armenia. Haigin was so thrilled with her example that the journal published not only a news piece entitled "The True Armenian Woman," in which Marx suggested that Armenia should save a place for this selfless woman so that she would be taken care of in her older age, but it also featured Derminasyan's photo on the cover page with the caption, quote, "She is a woman who is originally from a modest strata, but in fact, with her heart, she belongs in the highest. Her example is very inspiring." Haigin led the way by organizing a gold voskior, Golden Fund Day. Women were encouraged to participate in Hadisyan's campaign to, quote, "prove that they are competent patriots and that they can sacrifice a lot, since in a faraway land, their brothers are fighting to guarantee Armenian independence." Haigin and the association always supported the Armenian forces, Armenian soldiers, so that, quote, "the rivers of Armenia would not fill up with the blood of the innocent once again." Indeed, Armenian women's associations, both in Istanbul and in other cities where Armenians lived, such as in Cairo, Varna, and Batum, frequently sent money to Armenian soldiers and occasionally collected gifts from Armenian schools as well for Armenian soldiers, for example, at Christmas. After his departure from Istanbul in September 1920, Hadisyan wrote a personal thank you note to the Armenian Women's Association, in which he recognized the association's role in organizing a gold fund. His handwritten letter was published on the cover page of Haygin in place of the usual editorial. Haygin is silent after this point with regard to whether the Gold Fund Day was really organized or not. The project was probably aborted because of the striking political developments in Armenia, as in December 1920 the state was formally declared a socialist Soviet republic. Haygin passed over this significant development almost in silence, as if nothing much had changed in Armenia. The discourse of help to Armenian soldiers metamorphosed into calls for humanitarian aid to Soviet Armenia. The second interaction that I would like to highlight is that 1 year after Hadisyan's visit, a messenger from Soviet Armenia, a well-known poet and author, visited Istanbul with a similar cause, a similar reason. Hovhannes Tumanyan, head of the Armenian Aid Society, Hayuknutyan Mutyun, embarked on a tour of Armenian diaspora communities. So in both periods, Istanbul is considered as diaspora, now that I'm thinking, to collect financial aid for Soviet Armenia. In Istanbul, he stayed at an Armenian's house in Haygirzi, the same Armenian little island near Istanbul. Inhabitants, mostly Armenians still at this time of the island, were so enthusiastic about Tumanyan's visit that it is mentioned in various memoirs that they filled the garden of the house in which he was going to spend the night with the hopes of seeing him for just a minute. Like Hadisyan, in a meeting with the Armenian women of Istanbul, Tumanyan did not forget to emphasize women's unique role in the national survival and revival by saying that, quote, women's capacity to safeguard the national values are more effective than military power. Together with Anais, a well-known writer and social worker, also an Armenian Women's Association member and a contributor to Haygin, Tumanyan visited the office of Haygin, which was in Mark's apartment at the time. After revealing that he was, quote, true believer in feminism, unquote, and in Armenian women's potential, he encouraged Mark to continue the publication of her journal for decades to come. Like Hadisyan, Tumanyan believed that including Armenian women in the national struggle was crucial. Haygin shared this view wholeheartedly. For Armenians in Turkey, after the fall of 1922, Turkish occupation of Izmir, almost dramatically, as I see it, the national struggle metamorphosed from one of active, public, visible, loud Armenian nationalism to invisible, silent, inaudible, private, and arguably passive resistance to wholesale Turkification. So the nature of the resistance is changing, especially with the intensification of assimilationist Turkification policies. Armenian press in Istanbul covered Soviet Armenia less and less throughout the 20s. So after 24, at least in Haygin and in other journals also, we see a less frequent mention of Soviet Armenia. Other periodicals, especially newspapers, did cover Soviet Armenia, sometimes as foreign affairs, sometimes as Armenian affairs, much like they covered Armenian diaspora communities. For example, they would have a section called Haygagangyang, Armenian Life. There you would see the news of Armenian community in Greece, some kind of news from about an Armenian community in the States, and then you see a piece about Soviet Armenia. These changes clearly reflect the major changes that all Turkish Armenian periodicals endured from the immediate aftermath of World War I into the first decade of the Turkish Republic. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize that this paper only dealt with a number of interactions between political and financial representatives of Armenia and local Armenians in Istanbul. There were also a significant number of cultural and educational leaders, such as actors, actresses, dancers, writers, and teachers, who visited Istanbul from Armenia. the ways in which they were received by locals, and then how they themselves experienced and perceived the interaction with the locals remain to be explored and analyzed. And I would like to end my presentation with a research finding that I think is a bit perplexing. Not tremendously, I mean, I can make sense of it, but still I would like to, if possible, discuss with the members of the audience. Even though Haygin and many other contemporary periodicals, up until 92, spare every effort to encourage the repopulation of Western Armenian provinces, we do not see a promotion of whole-scale migration to a promised land. So, I'm not saying that no one wanted to migrate once Greater Armenia was established. Indeed, in the memoirs, we see references to people's intentions to migrate to Armenia later on. And clearly, many Bolshoi cultural intellectual elites ended up in Armenia, as we might hear more in the rest of the panel. But as far as I know, they left during and after 1922. So what I'm curious about is an absence from 1918 to 1922 in the discourse created by and disseminated among middle and upper class, mostly elite Bolshois. Why didn't they encourage mass migration to Armenia? Was this discourse shared by other contemporary Armenian communities worldwide? So in that sense, should I think of Istanbul as unique? I am hoping that we will entertain these and similar questions during the rest of this panel and this conference, and thank you.
I mean, she had defined her topic very precisely, chronologically, etc. And as she said, there were, Dr. Ekmekçioğlu, there were many other interesting aspects that could have been discussed. But such as the feverish activities that Constantinople was the stage for between 1918 and 1922, when after the Mudros armistice, when the city was under occupation, Allied occupation especially. Literary activities, women being active. This is interestingly typical of Armenians of Istanbul, Constantinople to be active in many fields. Since the 1850s, 60s, there were so many societies formed to promote education and other causes, and now we see, as Dr. Ekmekçioğlu told us about the efforts they made to promote Armenia politically. There was also the documentation that many Armenians were involved in for the tribunals that sat in Istanbul from about November of 1918, or the Young Turk trials that began in November of 1918, shortly after the Mudros business. So there were quite a few things going on at the time. But I would have liked to see more, of course, again, I'm not saying that she deliberately left this out, but her purpose was very limited to this periodical and, chronologically speaking, very intriguing attitudes towards Armenia, starting with Magakia Ormanyan, the former patriarch, to the Bandukhts, or the Armenian immigrants who were there in Armenia. So there are interesting attitudes that illustrate the deep gap that had developed between what we call Western Armenians and Eastern Armenians.
Couple of things. I tried to translate it as close to the original. If you don't like the message, don't shoot the messenger. It's the paper of Dr. Karen Khachadarian, the contribution of Soviet Armenian leaders to the strengthening of Armenia diaspora relations and the launching of repatriation. Secondly, I'm quoted in this. I didn't add it in the original. So I'm going to also read about what I have said in the paper. So it's just a coincidence. Armenia diaspora relations begin from the moment these two entities emerged in the aftermath of the First World War. The existence of an Armenian statehood since its re-establishment in May 1918 has provided the survivors of the Armenian genocide over the past century with hope and faith that they may settle on the territory of the Republic of Armenia, which is one part of their greater historical homeland. The First Republic of Armenia, from 1918 to 1920, was too short-lived to establish meaningful relations with Armenian communities abroad. Among its notable undertakings was the independence loan, for which the government appealed to the Armenian communities outside the homeland in 1919 and sent Prime Minister Alexander Khatisyan on a mission abroad. That same year, the first waves of Armenian refugees settled in the Republic from Russia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan.
So the first question regarding orthography, I sort of touched upon in passing when I was discussing Chobanyan. He seems to be, at this time, during the time of the second Congress, he seems to be the one who is most persistent on bringing back that issue or bringing it to the forefront and making it part of the Eastern-Western literary form discussion. He's very hopeful. He thinks that this is very temporary. The orthography is going to change within the next few years. It's not something that's going to stay. But in the other general discussions, no. There are comments that with regards to what I mentioned a few times in my paper, when diaspora writers are critical of Soviet Armenia's appreciation of language as a whole, and not only the representational value, but what language means for a culture, etc. They do, along with criticizing the infusion of Russian words in Eastern Armenian, they do criticize the orthography, which has made the language so alien, so foreign, and lessened it to this lower form, etc. So yes, but it's not central to the debate. I think perhaps from our standpoint, our current standpoint, we see that the orthography issue as something that separates diaspora from Armenia is more of a problem that's discussed, more so, I would say, even than the question of literary tradition, etc. So that's from a more current standpoint. But I mean, it's part of the debate, but not central. Second question, categories of East and West, if it's bound by land. There's some discussion about how even Armenian writers who repatriate should continue writing in Western Armenian in Armenia once they're in Armenia. So that kind of gives us an interesting, presents us with an interesting situation where you have the literary form detached from a particular definition of land, right? But the debate that's centralized in Beirut or that group of intellectuals, it's very much a Western diaspora, Eastern Soviet Armenia question from what I've seen so far. Vahevahyan, one of them, would agree with him. He stands out as a voice who believed in one literature, one people, one nation, and if that meant, I don't know exactly. He's writing in Western Armenian. He continues to write in Western Armenian, but he very much embraces that call. But the rest of diaspora writers would very much disagree with Topjian that writing in exile is not possible. In fact, that's what they do, and they create homeland out of language and literature. The final point about the reality of it, and which is true, if there's no readership, which is what's happening now, if there's no readership, it can't really sustain itself, right? But if we put it in the context of the 40s, I think Western Armenian language was experiencing something completely different than its current state. And as these schools were multiplying in the Middle East, and there these projects to revive the language, cleanse it of its Turkish remnants, etc., were taking place, new generations were coming forth that could read Western Armenian literature, and that did. Of course, that sort of didn't last I don't think if we look at the current state of Western Armenian literature, but I think in the context of the 40s, that I don't think that's the case.
Obviously, the period covered by Dr. Shahinian is a very complex politically, and the situation and expectations and obligations and requirements, all these change from 1943, when the war is coming to an end, and Armenians hope that border changes will be to their own benefit. 45, 46, when you have repatriation, slight improvement of links. Then you have 47, Cold War, and in Soviet context, Zhdanovshchina, that attack on cultural values and other things. And here comes a sharp attack on Western Armenian, which is described as a dialect, not as a language, etc. But then that also dies down even before Stalin's death. Let's say in the 1950s, we already see some of those attacked under Zhdanovshchina gradually rehabilitated. And then it really goes. So we have to look all these things and see what was the broader context when all these articles and other things were being written in a very fastly changing political environment, and of course which affects culture very much. And culture has now become so essential for the Soviet elite that they are imposing very strict guidelines, which prior to that they were not doing so. I believe this has to be taken into consideration when we are finalizing a paper like this.
Small question. Did I hear correctly that Zhdanov was present?
Yes.
Okay, I thought you said that.
But
Yeah,
but of course, he had not become that notorious in 46. I think it's towards the end of 46, 47 that attack begins, first with the article on Akhmatova and that theater group, etc. Okay, now we have Vartan Matyosyan, who has an educational administrative position connected to the Armenian prelacy in New York. And Vartan, of course, will be covering two periods. Before Stalin, the period of new economic policy, and post-Stalin, late Khrushchev, early Brezhnev, where Kostan Zaryan tried his luck in Armenia.
Kostan Zaryan is a writer that may be known to many of you, since there are 3 books in English translated of his work, even if they are partial translations, but they may help to get an idea of his writing. Anyway, he still remains, despite the publication of many of his works in the last 20 years, he still remains a somehow neglected writer, despite being a foremost name in Armenian literature of the 20th century. Born in 1885 and dead in 1969, Kostan Zaryan's lifespan covered 8 crucial decades for Armenian life. He was active in Constantinople with the Western Armenian generation before the genocide, before the catastrophe, before and after 1915, and with an interval of 2 years in Soviet Armenia. He would go abroad to live in various places, from Paris to California and from Venice to Beirut, to settle back in Armenia for the last 6 years of his life. So my paper is intended at discussing in some detail, not too much, his first sojourn in Armenia, and then in more detail his last sojourn. Zaryan lived across two worlds. He was a sort of wandering Armenian, both physically and spiritually. He represented a curious mixture of cultures and influences. Very early in his life, he was exiled from his birthplace, his family, his language. He would rebuild an identity of his own after making a passage through the West. In a certain sense, and without knowing it, he was the archetype of diaspora years before the foundations of the diaspora were effectively laid. He was conscious of the fact that there was a clear-cut displacement in Armenian life and that a change was strongly needed. As early as 1918, when the effects of the catastrophe were still ongoing and the fate of the survivor was unclear, he had stated some essential concepts in a letter to Arshak Chobanian. It remains to get Paroyabes ready to enjoy freedom. The nation is not a geographical or local or linguistic conglomerate, but a symbol creating ethical link which must be created with unending work. The Armenian nation must be created by poets and Paroyakets, otherwise the age-old sacrifice will be lost in vain. The word paroyaket is here the crux of the problem. It usually means, in English, moralist. However, here it bears no relation with moral, but with ethos, the Greek word ethos, Armenian park, and in the same fashion, paroiabes, ethically, so to speak, comes from ethos, the guiding beliefs of a community. What is a paroyaket? He is at the same time an ethnologist, a collector of anthropological information, and an ethnographer, an analyst of such information, who recreates the religious foundations of the people. A community is shaped and renovated through sacrifice. The victim, the age-old sacrifice, becomes a renovating force, which will be lost in vain if the artist, maker of the sacrifice, does not take charge of the act as a means of creation. The letter was written in Italy barely 2 months after the declaration of independence of Armenia, when the country was still struggling between life and death. Zarjan traveled to the Caucasus in September-November 1919 as a correspondent for several Italian newspapers. After sojourning in Constantinople from 1921-22, he moved to Armenia with his family in November 1922. This move was prompted by an invitation from the Soviet Armenian government, circulated to many intellectuals and men of culture. The details of how Zarjan decided the move are yet unknown. One may assume that he was enthused by the idea of helping to create a nation, regardless of the political regime. He taught European literature at the University of Yerevan, published articles on literature and theater, and a few poems. A year and a half later, in June 1924, he departed with his family to Europe. He was technically on a mission on behalf of the Hayastani-Okhnoutian Committee, HOK, Committee of Relief to Armenia, and the University of Yerevan, and thus he was bound to return. However, he did not. He turned to the diaspora and made turns in the diaspora for the next 40 years. He settled first in Paris, where he kept a friendly attitude towards the Soviet regime for more or less a year, and then he moved to Venice. There he started to write and serially publish his memoir on his sojourn in Armenia, Ansor de Vir Jampan, The Wanderer and His Road, 1926-1928, that started his association with the monthly Hyrenik published by the ARF in Boston. Filled with devastating swipes towards the regime, it also contained many reflections on the status of the Armenian people and its present and future. The memoir would be continued with a massive piece of fiction, the unfinished novel Bankopoi of Mamutivos Kornera, The Workers' Cooperative and the Bones of the Mammoth, also published in a Hyrenik monthly from 1931-33. He dealt extensively with the theme of nation building both of these works. He wrote, for instance, I quote, "The spirit becomes a creative force when it is converted into a living organism. Peoples are alive when they search for their inner and deep law. Real life is not an amount of ideas, but spiritual quality and standing, a certain way of expressing life, a sense of responsibility and creative ability." End of quote. Zarjan opposed his idea of a spiritual construct to the material construct already in the works in Armenia as part of the communist ideology, as he wrote in a letter of 1931 again to Arshak Chobanian. I believe, like you, that we must materially protect what we have, avoid adventures, and reinforce construction. But we also have to save the free spirit of the Armenian individual. Otherwise, tomorrow, especially if the Bolshevik system succeeds, we will disappear as a sovereign element, as a nation, as we are disappearing in America. Tomorrow, Russia will become more absorptive than America, and no abstract border will be able to protect us if our free spirit and deep national awareness are dead. In the preface to his third major work in Hyrenik Monthly, the travelogue Yergineri Vasvazner, Countries and Gods, 1935-38, he added, quote again, "All these questions are mostly of interest for those who are aware of that we are going through the most dangerous and crucial period of our history, and who feel responsible before that history. In particular, they feel responsible before our country, because there cannot be life and cannot be history outside the country. When I say country, I want to say that given uncertain place of land where the Armenian people lives and acts, where despite external circumstances the Armenian spirit is being forged anew, the nation is being rebuilt, the new historical myth and the new Armenian individual are being born. End of quote. How are nation and myth, that is to say literature, linked? In 1932, Hagop Oshagan made a revealing yet difficult to understand remark. Writing is such a wide and public phenomenon that we can only compare it to the moral ethos created by religions in ancient times. In the same way, Paroyakids have uncovered a few great, beautiful things in that area. Authentic critics can uncover a few great, simple, and deep laws from literature. Writing, therefore, becomes a creative force as binding as religion. It shapes the ethos of the community whom it is addressed. It collects its dispersed fragments and gives form to an otherwise formless situation. In 1943, Zarian published his most ambitious novel, Navele Ramvra, The Ship on the Mountain. The novel was settled in the days of the First Republic of Armenia, 1918-1920, and as the author remarked in the preface, quote, "It is the story of a few Armenian souls bound to live through one of the most crucial periods of our national life. No one should look either for historical inaccuracies. It is not a book of history, but a book of spirit." End of quote. Here we find the main idea, an ambitious one, a novel, a book of spirit as an instrument to bring the past into the present and set the path for, and even shape, a cultural renaissance. This is reminiscent of recent trends in third world literature, where, as Timothy Brennan has pointed out, quote, "Many of the novels often attempt to assemble the fragments of a national life and give them a final shape. They become documents designed to prove national consciousness with multiple myriad components that display an active communal life." End of quote. The novel depicts the story of Ara Sanjian, a seafarer captain who struggles during the Republic years to bring a ship from the Black Sea coast to Lake Sevan. The story is based on reality. By the fall of the Republic, the real ship had actually stopped at a hill near Yerevan. Quote, "The ship on the city, a sort of living statue, symbolic and attractive, its shadow was dominating daily life, inspiring strength and faith, waking golden dreams," said Zarian. He reminds us that peoples have founded their mythology over small but idiosyncratic proofs. The idiosyncratic proof given above was enough to build the myth, the ship of the mountain. Here the myth of Noah's Ark is transposed to modern times. After the deluge, namely the catastrophe, the ship has settled on the peak of the mountain from where a new life will start. The devastated country will flourish and the ruins will be rebuilt. But the Ark story is just the tip of the iceberg. Underneath we find a far more general subject, which is part of the myth of the eternal return. As Mircea Eliade has stated, the sacred mountain where heaven and earth meet is at the center of the world. The function of the center is to become the beginning of creation. The narrator will lead the ship through thorny and twisted roads, through moments of desperation and hope to realize what is still in a world of thoughts and dreams. I quote, "In my book," said Zarian, "I try to express the indomitable Armenian Voki. To talk about Armenian Voki is like trying to climb a steep mountain, pushing away the thorny brambles and barbs clogging the path and bleeding as you climb. It's the most difficult and dangerous climb, but once you get there, you can expand your lungs and breathe in deeply the clean, crystal clear air, and let your eyes absorb the ravishing scenery. It makes you feel alive and whole." End of quote. Armenians are alive and whole when the Voki, the spirit, has reached its fulfillment, when their unnatural situation has been overcome. The ship has reached the mountain and it's on the mountain. There the Araratian man will be born, believes Zarian. The title of the novel is ambiguous. The mountain is a center in itself, a point of reference. The ship is geared towards holiness, the state of nature where everything is eternally repeated. The place becomes sacred when the archetype realizes the sacrifice. He creates and establishes the rite. Zarian declared later, "The Armenian Voki," he said, "was enlivened by the majestic mountains of our land, which constantly reminds us to ascend higher. Armenian mountains and Armenian people have interpenetrated each other. They are organically related, fused. We have given them our sweat and blood, and they have given us iron and stones. The sheep on the mountain means therefore the spirit in the center. Spirit is not just a metaphysical concept, but a synonym for culture in its widest sense. When culture reaches its center, it means that the risk of disintegration has been overcome. Zarian thus constructs a bipolar dialectics, homeland versus diaspora. The motherland is the place of reunion, while diaspora means dispersion and then disposal. The scattered pieces have to be reconstructed to get a unity, or else they will become waste. The centripetal force which attracts the pieces towards the center must overcome all the contrary forces. Otherwise, Armenian culture will not regain its completeness. Therefore, his refusal of the diaspora begins. I quote again from The Sheep on the Mountain. However, when the centripetal force weakens, when that force is not a powerful, always renovating, always creating attraction, the remnants expelled from the land gradually diminish and later become dust. Centrifugal forces metamorphose everything: language, religion, the concept of nationality, and motherland. Reality is veiled by hollow words. Conventional images are created deprived of capacity to grow and of sap to flourish. The following happens. The centripetal force no longer leads the particles, but the particles adapt to basic ideas of that force to their immediate local conditions by altering it, shifting its normal course and covering its vital symbol. The nation ceases to exist, and a certain nation-like thing takes its place. Instead of a dominant thought, we said that race is thought, different thoughts have been created. The central light, the light with which the nation enlightens its mystery of being, establishes its universal importance, extends the torch of its blood, has been veiled. The idea is very clear. Diaspora means loss, corruption, deformation. The concept of centralization is underlined through Heria, the captain born in an Armenian village after traveling throughout the world for years, set out to return to the homeland. Another seaman, Tumanian, a former officer of the Tsarist fleet, has done the same. In this way, Zarian thinks, the nation-like thing starts the long road to become a nation. This was a metaphor for the author himself. In the 1940s, Zarian had started to soften his criticism of the Soviet system. In the preface of The Sheep on the Mountain, he also wrote, "If this novel, by recalling the past still hurting in our bodies and hearts in these decisive days, would be able to contribute to the rebirth of the Armenian spirit in the humblest way, the author would consider himself fortunate. Those were the years when Armenians all over the diaspora and even the ARF were supporting Soviet Armenia and the Soviet effort of war, since the mounting danger of Nazi advance to the Caucasus had the potential to bring Turkey into the war. In the 1950s, the death of Stalin and the beginning of the thaw during Nikita Khrushchev's leadership, even in the toxic environment of Cold War, seems to have accelerated the process. Many statements by Zarian in that decade point out to that. In a journal entry of June 1954, he wrote, "Simon Simonian came and spoke about Armenia with foam in the mouth. Everything is wonderful," I said. That's the same that they come and tell me that my father lives in palaces and pleasures, and I am incapable of going near him. They forget that Armenia is a discovery for them, but my country for me." A letter of February 1958 to French Armenian writer Raj Zartarian was more explicit. "The first condition for the creative Armenian intellectual is to keep the spiritual link with Armenia, not to feel himself as an immigrant but an exile. To complement the work of Armenians there and do what they cannot do because of political reasons. To prepare himself for tomorrow's encounter. To be ready to return home with full hands, clean face, bright eyes, fer and sefazan, to make when making himself." Another letter of 1958 to another French Armenian writer, Zarev Orpuni, stressed, "It is good that Armenia is present in the hearts in one way or another. Armenians in the diaspora are about to pulverize, and if the long-distance presence of Armenia does not inspire them in some way, there will be no national feelings remaining in a few years." Zarian became more vocal. In an article written in August 1959, he underscored one more time the difference between being an emigrant and an exile. He, the emigrant, he means, is a shadow that searches a new moral body, a new language, a new way to exist and to live. When he finds that new body, he disappears. The exile is different. He is a temporary visitor, a wayfarer whose personality is eternally anchored in his essence, in his secular collective body, in his ethnic consciousness. The equation exile-wayfarer already shows that Zarian was far from considering himself an emigrant. He saw himself as someone who temporarily lived out of the country. In an interview published in 1960, he also became politically incorrect. The diaspora, he said, I do not like that word, may have a great role if it frees itself from the prejudice that its supposed role to it is its supposed role to criticize and see in a negative way everything related to Soviet Armenia. If Armenians abroad do not create and do not feel themselves as part of the whole, they will be pulverized. Because of the illness of his second wife, the American painter Frances Brooks, Zarian moved with her from Italy to California at the beginning of 1959. In July 1960, he met Vasquez I, Catholicos of all Armenians, during his first pastoral visit to the United States. The Catholicos invited the writer to visit Armenia and promised him to have his last work published. Zarian officially visited Armenia in July-August of that year with his daughter. 10 days after his arrival, he was interviewed on the radio of Yerevan by Hracha Grigorian, the literary critic who was the former secretary of the Armenian Writers' Union, and an Orthodox Party member, of course. Zarian reasserted here in a forceful way the rejection of the diaspora, which he called Armenianness. He just suppressed the name diaspora from his mind, formulated 20 years before. I quote, "The young and able part of that Armenianness must congregate around Yerevan, our new Athens, inspire with it, and make its contribution and recover its will and impulse to live as Armenian. The Armenian youth abroad is confused, demoralized, and under the risk of being pulverized. It is necessary and important to relate it to the motherland, to acquaint it to our cultural values, and also to the immense possibilities that are opened before it." In the same interview, he made an attack against the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, accusing it of being headed by old traders and half intellectuals and having become an instrument in the hands of anti-Soviet knights. The interview triggered a violent reaction in the Armenian press. The ARF harshly criticized Zarian for what it was perceived as a full turnaround, which was not, while Ramgavars, Hanchakians, and communists sang his praises after many years of almost ignoring him. For the same reason, another heated chapter of Cold War rhetorics was going on to be written over the next 2 or 3 years. The reason was that in the days following the interview, there was a resolution from the higher bodies of Soviet Armenia about the publication of any of Gostan Zarian's works, wrote Hracha Grigorian in a letter of 1962. The book chosen by the Writers' Union and the state press was The Ship on the Mountain, probably following Zarian's suggestion. On July 30, 1961, Edward Topchian, first secretary of the Writers' Union, wrote an opinion where he conditioned the publication to what amounted to be the rewriting of the novel. He said, "Our remarks end in the basic ideological and literary reworking, Himnagan Veramashagum, of the novel, and this work must be done. It is necessary to give the former novel a new ideological contents and practically create a new work. And only in this case the novel The Ship on the Mountain will deserve to be published here in Soviet Armenia." Zarian wanted to publish the novel as it was, but indeed he was forced to do something else, with Grigorian as designated editor. He worked together with the author and some changes were made, both in form and content, during the summer of 1961. Even a chapter was added where the ship reached Lake Sevan after Sovietization. This did not satisfy the Soviet bureaucracy and the work was stopped for almost a year. Finally, new changes were made, with or without the writer's tacit consent, between June 1962 and January 1963, and when the novel was sent to the printer. Meanwhile, Zarian had set himself to his ultimate end, which was to return to Armenia. The advanced age, his 40 years of exile, some optimistic winds coming from Khrushchev's toe, convinced him that the return was feasible. But the decisive fact was his wife's terminal illness, She belonged to a well-to-do family. Her father was the owner of a bank and received a monthly stipend as a source of income. A legal clause established that the stipend was allocated to their son, to Zayan's and his wife's son, in case of her death, and Zayan did not have any rights over it. His wife encouraged him to return to Armenia. She did not want her husband to stay alone in the diaspora, deprived of any financial means. He finally returned together with his son from his first marriage, the architect Armen Zayan and his family, on June 15, 1963. 12 days later, the whitewashed and bowdlerized edition of The Ship on the Mountain came off the press. In the preface, Hracia Grigorian has stressed that, I quote, "In the first variant of the novel," meaning the 1943 edition, which was published by Heinrich Press, the author had already expressed his negative attitude towards the ARF and its adventurous tactics. He exposed with deep irony the banditism of Dashnaksagan soldiers and Mozarists. The author's attitude towards Dashnaksagan activists is clearly expressed. He absolutely despises them. End of quote. Another outcry made the rounds in the diaspora press when the echoes of the 1961 controversy had barely extinguished. Zayan had no other choice than to publicly take responsibility for the new edition, but he privately rejected it. The following excerpts of his journal entries from 1964, published in post-Soviet times, are quite eloquent. I quote, "I want to be known that the second edition of The Ship was published under duress, cheating, and menace. The last part of the second edition is entirely superfluous, the same as many changes in the novel. At the time, I lived in a precarious spiritual situation because of my wife's illness, and neither the novel interested me nor what happened around me. Indeed, I will describe the events in detail, but I want them to know by this means that my novel is what was published abroad with very insignificant changes, and after my death, when they reprint it, the second edition must be left aside altogether." End of quote. Incredibly enough, he had forgotten his personal experience in the 1920s and the example of the publication of Dr. Zhivago in 1957. Zayan had been deeply convinced, said his son Armen 3 decades later, I quote, "that coming to his country here in Armenia, he would be able to publish his complete works and could not imagine that literature is being used here as a political instrument, as it happened with the novel The Ship on the Mountain." End of quote. The circle had been fully closed. Like Ara Sanjian, Zayan had returned to Armenia to bring his personal ship to the mountain. His works were not published, he lived in the shadow, and he died half forgotten. The ship had remained halfway to the mountain. As a possible metaphor of the strained relations between homeland and diaspora, the spirit did not reach the center. Thank you.
My presentation is going to be on the Armenia's foreign ministry in the period between 1998 and 2008 as an institution, part of the state, and how did it interact, or what were the priorities, what were the issues related to this center or this institution and the diaspora. So basically what I'm going to do, go briefly over the choices that I've made for the research, why these choices and so on, plus the methodology. Then give a very brief overview of the foreign ministry, not in terms of the structure and so on, but in terms of a mandate as it is related to the issue of the Armenia diaspora relations. Specifically, then I would go into foreign ministry and diaspora relations and the different stages or different formats that it took, and perhaps finish with some of my thoughts about possibilities or which direction this is heading. Well, obviously, it makes it easier if this is not comparative. If it's not a comparative work, it's easier to take one stretch, one administration. So between 98 and 2008, we're talking about the administration of Robert Kocharyan. The other thing is that the interesting and the research is that the foreign ministry, also the foreign minister remained the same during that period. So far, the longest serving foreign minister. The other thing is that it's also good to look at this as a transition, because the theme of the overall conference is transition, going from the early 20th century to Soviet to post-Soviet and so on. So this period is also a transition period between the first administration and today. And one of the other things I need to clarify here, and it's not because we live in the United States that the choice that I look at as a community or as a diaspora is the United States, but most of the interviews that I had, usually from the perspective of the foreign ministry or the people who have formulated the policies in foreign ministry vis-a-vis the diaspora, were talking about or thinking about the United States, the Armenian community in the United States, rather than the overall Armenian community throughout. What have I done to prepare these? Interviews mostly, personal and phone interviews with officials. I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, but most of the people, if not all of them actually, were hesitant, and they asked me to make it anonymous interviews, understandably so in some cases. Email correspondence. And non-interviews. This was an interesting thing because when I contacted one individual asking them to interview them about this issue, I got a whole lecture about why it's not a good idea to talk about Armenian diaspora relations looking only from the foreign ministry and so on and so forth. And eventually, obviously, it was a bummer. Eventually, one thing I realized that most probably this is the reason why they said so is so that if there were any blames, any finger pointing, they wouldn't take the whole blame. I tried to explain that this is not a systemic study. It's like rather institutional, but no luck in there. And obviously, to a lesser extent, personal interviews. When I lived in Armenia between 2000 and 2002, I worked, I wouldn't call it work, but I hanged out at the foreign ministry, let's say, at an office called Armenia Diaspora Office, which I will be talking about in a moment. So all of these are a compilation of the basis of my research. And obviously also looking at scholarship, previous scholarship, the names of the scholars there. And these are people who have talked actually not about the diaspora as a phenomenon per se, but the institutional relations between diaspora and homeland. Obviously the case here is more often than not is Israel and the Jewish community or Jewish diaspora. But there were some interesting cases in the Indian government and Indian diaspora, which it's, again, I couldn't remember now because it's gone. But so one of the things that we need to look at is to what extent 98 was a year of change. Well, a couple of things that happened. One might think that it was change in terms of faces, in terms of individuals, and so on. In February 1998, there was a palace coup against Levon Ter-Bedrosyan, and in March of that same year, Kocharyan got elected as president. And for a very brief period, March was also between March and April, the former foreign minister of Armenia became the head, the executive manager, or the executive chairman of Armenia Fund. The reason why I mentioned the third one, perhaps the first two are relevant or obviously relevant, is because one of the key components of Armenia's relations with the diaspora, within the context also partially of a foreign ministry, Armenia Fund became that link, or was considered to be that mechanism or that institution which fosters, which promotes relations with the diaspora. Now let's look at some assumptions and expectations that happened after 1998 in terms of change. One perception was that after 1998, Armenia's relations with the diaspora would improve. Specifically when we're talking about Armenia diaspora relations improving, we're talking about one section or one segment of the, perhaps larger than some of the other segments, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, which by 1994 was banned. In 1994 was banned for legal purpose, with legal emphasis on the banning and political to some extent. And the whole point was now the ARF, the Dashnak Suchun Party, would come back and get involved in the politics, which means a larger segment of the diaspora would be involved in policy making. The other thing is that by bringing the Dashnak Suchun into the process and making them part of Armenia Fund, funds would increase. Armenia Fund would raise more money. Actually, in one of my interviews, one number that was given was $400 million. They were expecting that at some point there was going to be $400 million coming in through Armenia Fund. Now, just for comparison, prior to 1998, the most that was ever raised with Armenia Fund was in 92-93 Winter Aid, which was about $21 million. And then later in, I think, 2007, it was $35 million, but never the $400 million, which I will be talking briefly about as well. And the third point was that, and this is actually, you can see in the I hope you can see in the quote, when Kocharyan giving his inaugural address at the National Assembly, one of the things that he focused on or he mentioned is that we are going to develop new relations with the diaspora, we have to work together, etc., etc., but more importantly, introducing or allowing dual citizenship in Armenia to get the diaspora more involved with the homeland. Some of the other expectations is the genocide issue. Obviously, this is a conference on diaspora Armenia, so genocide plays, whether we like it or not, a role in all of this, be that in literature or in politics. And the misconception here, or expectation here, was that after 1998, after the change of regime, there's going to be reintroduction of the genocide into Armenia's foreign policy agenda. It was considered to be a strategic move, not perceived from the government at least, not a tactical move. And by doing so, there was an assumption that the diaspora would get more excited, become more involved in Armenian life, in Armenian foreign policy, and so on. And there was a major misconception, and I will let you know why it's a misconception, that there was going to be a break from the previous regime. And this is actually, the quote is from memory, completely from memory, because I remember in early 1998, after the new administration was elected, Vartan Oskanyan, who was the newly appointed foreign minister at that time, paid a visit to Boston. And he basically, at a meeting in one of the church halls, he mentioned that from now on we're going to make the genocide issue a priority in our foreign policy. And not surprisingly, everyone in that room started applauding hysterically, which it makes sense, I think, if you understand or if you look at it in the context that what extent this was an important issue for at least those people in the whole. Now, some of these issues are misconceptions. First of all, the ARF was involved, and re-involvement of the ARF in Armenian life started before 1998. There were talks in 1997, at least 6 months before the coup. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the ARF was part of the Armenia Fund throughout, through either sister organizations or affiliate organizations and so on. Diaspora investments remain static, as I mentioned earlier. The whole 400 million, the diaspora would come in on a white horse to increase investments and so on and so forth, never happened. And more importantly, the issue of dual citizenship, which was promised in 1998, was only realized in 2007. Now, I'm not going to go into the analysis of why that late. Obviously, some analysis would be it wasn't a priority, it was lip service. Secondly, it might have been because of the fact that Kocharyan waited until his term would be over so that the new citizens would not have an impact on the election. But the thing is that it didn't happen until 9 years later. Some of the other misconceptions, the issue of the genocide. The whole argument that there would have been a break from Der Bedrosian's regime on his position about the genocide was, again, a misconception. First of all, Der Bedrosian's administration never admitted. So the genocide issue under Levon Der Bedrosian was there, but it wasn't a priority. It wasn't on the top list in terms of Armenia's foreign policy. Rather, actually, there wasn't any backpedaling as well on this issue. For instance, in one case, in one of my interviews, one official said in 1994 when President Der Bedrosian visited London, one of the things that he mentioned to officials, he said that we will not allow a second genocide to happen in Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, it is perhaps out of context, but to the fact that he had mentioned this, or at least my interviewees mentioned this as he had mentioned this, or he has said this, shows to what extent, or to some extent, that the genocide was not a completely sort of marginalized issue in his administration. Secondly, in 1995, another reason why we have to think that genocide was present in the collective psyche of the administration was that in 1995 the Genocide Museum was opened, and the same year there was a conference on the genocide in Yerevan. So if this is a government which is not interested, administration which was not interested in making this an issue, these things wouldn't have happened. And finally, another misconception is that before 1998, there was no synergy or there was no cooperation between Armenia and the diaspora, at least when it came to the issue of lobbying. According to one official, there was in very close cooperation between Armenian government and Armenian lobby groups in the United States, actually more than one official. And usually the way that they operated on was that the lobby groups, the Armenian lobby groups, the ANCA and the Armenian Assembly of America, were basically focusing on the legislative branch, whereas the embassy worked with the executive branch. So you can see there is a cooperation or coordination, let's put it that way. And also there are legal aspects here that as a representative of a foreign body or a foreign government, you do not have the right to intervene in the legislative process of your host country. But you can deal with the executive branch, and that gave the embassy, Armenian embassy here in the United States, some leeway to operate within that context. Another thing is looking at the causality of the genocide recognition. After 1998, I have three countries here: France, Belgium, and Italy, where genocide was recognized. Now, the question would be, in the case of France, in May 1998, the National Assembly of France basically passed a resolution. In November 2000, the Senate passed a resolution, the French Senate. In Belgium, in March 1998, again, a resolution about the genocide, supporting the genocide. And in Italy, for instance, in 2000, again, there was a resolution to accept the genocide or to recognize the genocide. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because if you look at it, a process such as recognition of the genocide in some of these countries, it doesn't happen overnight. So obviously you had to prepare the groundwork, you had to do the lobbying and so on and so forth, be that at a state level or at a community level. And it shows to what extent that this genocide recognition process is not something that was on hold for up until 98 and then started to reemerge after 1998. Now, talking about the foreign ministry itself, one phenomenon which is interesting and which highlights, I think, the role that an individual could play in foreign policy making was, and again, I have to remind my disclaimer that this is all based on memories of some of the interviews, but one point that was raised by several individuals was that Armenia's foreign policy formulation before 1998 was a team process. In other words, the president, along with the foreign minister, senior advisors, and some ambassadors, high-ranking ambassadors, would basically formulate or discuss foreign policy. However, after 1998, there was an interesting division of task. President Kocharyan basically took upon himself the task or the responsibility, or sole responsibility, to deal with everything related to Russia and to a lesser extent Iran, and delegated everything else to the foreign ministry, including relations with the diaspora. Now, the reason why this is important to mention is, and to think about it in retrospective, it means that never before, and I don't think never since up until today, a foreign minister in Armenia had so much power as an individual in terms of decision making and in terms of freedom of movement and policy making. This is all because of different factors. I think the fact that the foreign minister was a diasporan born, that also was a factor why the relations with the diaspora was delegated to his ministry and to him. But at the same time, it might also be because Oskanyan was part of the institution since the early days, so he was the more knowledgeable person than Kocharyan was in many of the foreign policy formulations. But then the next major thing was the diaspora conferences. Now, the diaspora conferences, the first one held in 1999, was an attempt by then late Prime Minister Vasyan Sargsyan to create a multi-agency relations with the diaspora, rather than relying on one ministry or one body within the government, Armenian government. It would have been, he was envisioning a mechanism of creating links between different organizations and different institutions on the Armenia's side with diasporan bodies. And in the words of one interviewee, these were not diaspora Armenia conferences or Armenia diaspora conferences. These were conferences of diasporans in Armenia, because it didn't create linkages. It was to a large extent, a mechanism for diasporans to come together, which could have happened anywhere else without any much impact on the substance of these meetings. Now, in my opinion, the Armenia Diaspora Office, which, as I said, was an informal office attached to the foreign ministry, was the more active in terms of developing relations and projects with the diaspora. It was an informal extension. It was viewed as an informal extension of the minister himself. So the person who was in charge of this office was actually had a title of assistant to the, advisor to the foreign minister, rather than any official other title, head of the department and whatnot. It didn't have any official structure. It didn't have any funding, other than in-house donation of an office and computers. It had a skeletal staff of 3 people. At some point, it increased to 5 and 6, depending on the on timeline and events happening at the time. And the interesting thing is that it didn't have a specific mandate. It wasn't told or asked to focus on one thing. So the mandate that this office had was quite large. The fact that it didn't have funding also was also a good thing, because it gave this office pretty much flexibility to do a lot of things. And some of the things that they did was, for instance, one of the things was helping Armenian repats. And I have actually, if you look at, you cannot, but in my presentation I say I put in parentheses, which is a different story because I don't look at it as repatriation. We can go into that at a different time. But it was basically to help Armenians who have moved to Armenia in terms of assistance, advice, and so on, perhaps helping them with some of the bureaucracy and so on and so forth. It also created a website which is active up until today, the Armenia Diaspora website, which originally was formed to become a link. It included all the information about Armenia diaspora conferences, which this office, by the way, was one of the it was the nucleus of this conference in terms of getting the invitations, organizing the agenda, and so on and so forth. And also creating a database of Armenian professionals, both in and outside of Armenia. Now, to what extent that was used, we're not going to go into that, but this shows the diversity. As if that wasn't enough, some of the other works that they did, there was a Kafesjan Monument Project, which basically 20 touristic sites were identified, and they were going to be given funds to renovate, build, and whatnot. And this office was actually in charge of it. As you can see, the mandate going from professional, develop professional databases and so on, to cultural stuff. Some of the other things that you might have known or heard, the e-visa was introduced by this office. The reason why I'm mentioning these is because more or less these are projects which have included or do include or have impacted diasporans. So the e-visa, which was introduced, which was supposed to be helpful for Armenians visiting Armenia, diasporans. And one of the final things that they did was the Rural Development Project, which basically solicit funds to develop the rural areas in Armenia and invest in them. Now, strategically speaking, the the mission of the ministry, and I have ministry in quotation marks, again, there was no articulated mission, but some of the things, and this is from what I've read, what I've heard from the interviews, is very much dependent on the minister himself. So we're talking about developing institutions, but you cannot have an institution with a single person. But one of the images or one of the perceptions that the minister had was for the ministry to become to coordinate lobbying, not to control, but to coordinate lobbying, which included informing the diaspora and special lobby groups in the diaspora with foreign policy priorities of the state. It was also one of the missions was to institutionalize Armenia diaspora relations, something that doesn't exist, even with the fact that you have an Armenia diaspora relations. There are no institutions that link, that you can go and say that this is the institution that me as a diasporan can go and associate with to be able to have some connection with the government, with the country. And also to develop an infrastructure for that interaction. In other words, conferences, symposia, and so on and so forth. These were some of the missions or some of the goals of the ministry. Now, one of the problems, and when you look at an institution, you cannot isolate it from a system. And there were some endemic systemic problems in the way the Armenian government operated, which had its influence on the foreign ministry and its work, especially the diaspora office. First of all, it was clear that Armenia diaspora relations had to be multi-agency. It cannot be owned. It cannot be controlled, or it cannot be managed by a single ministry. Mostly because of the fact that you have a multi-nuanced diaspora, you have a multi-nuanced interests, and as such you have to bring in the relevant government agencies into that. The other thing is that during that period, and perhaps up until now as well, the way that Armenia's foreign policy functioned, it was a tactical reaction rather than a strategic vision. So this also had its impact on the Armenian diaspora relations. So there was no strategic vision as what do we want Armenian diaspora to do. It was more tactical. We need to get this rural development. Let's do this. We need I don't know. We need to get more diasporans coming in for tourist sites. We do introduce e-visa and so on and so forth. And more often than not, with a change of administration, change of government, change of people, the newcomers always want to reinvent the wheel, which is time-consuming, obviously, but it's also the lack of continuity makes it very difficult to develop the institutions. And as I said, the reliance on individuals rather than institutions is one of perhaps the most important shortcomings of be that the foreign ministry or any dimension or any department which deals with the Armenian diaspora issues. Now, I think one of the major problems is that after 1998, while there were some linkages, there were some interactions between the foreign ministry and the diaspora during the period 98 to 2008, these didn't go beyond individual and very limited rather than group or organizational interactions. Furthermore, I think the beginning of the system, or the beginning of this tenure of 1998, while it started with a coup, palace coup, although it wasn't as explosive in terms of changing the phenomenon or creating a bang in the system, it ended with a bang. I think the 2008 elections became a very important turning point to increase the gap between the Armenians in Armenia and in the diaspora. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but the fact that most of the diaspora was stood aside while people in Armenia were demonstrating against the violations during the election and so on, created a gap, not so much as in the minds of the diasporans, but more so in the minds of the Armenian population inside Armenia, thinking that they are disconnected from us. The Ministry of Diaspora is another thing that is a new creation, and one of the things that I learned from a colleague of mine who's an architecture historian this is a term used in architecture, obviously, is a form over function. And the Ministry of Diaspora is form over function. It is a good thing. It is a lip service. It boosts the morale that we have a ministry especially for you. But as of now, it doesn't have any substance in a way that it can act as mediator between diaspora and Armenia. Final 2 points is that the diaspora malaise in overall, as the diaspora after 20 years I think there's a growing malaise in terms of we don't care about again, I'm simplifying this, but more disconnect with the republic. I'm not saying that all of the diaspora is that, but overall the initial enthusiasm to be involved, to be part of this process has declined tremendously. And the final thought that I had was to what extent these are irreconcilable differences between the diaspora and Armenia, and to what extent institutions could play a role in that. I believe that any difference could be reconciled. But when it requires dialogue, and dialogue based on mutual respect, and dialogue based on listening. And at this point, more often than not, the diaspora and Armenia, rather than talking with each other, usually talk at each other. Thank you.
It's quite difficult to be the last speaker, especially after Aspet covered so well the topic, and after this morning when we had two panelists talking about literature, about symbols, about mythology, about poetry, about novels, about writers' unions, to go back and talk about more dry and immediate subjects as the protocols in a discipline which is mine, which is international relations. But I hope I will still keep your attention for 20 minutes. What I will try to do is to talk about the protocols, Turkey-Armenia protocols, and through this example, try to reflect on a couple of questions. This morning there were questions whether there can be language surviving outside the homeland, whether there can be literature outside the official Soviet Armenian literature surviving in exile in diaspora. Even there was a question whether history can exist outside outside the land, outside Yergir. So my question, the question I'm asking now is whether there can be politics existing outside the fatherland, a new term I learned this morning. Other questions in relation with this topic that I have is whether you can have non-state actors elevated into the ranks and activities of a sphere, international relations, which is the domain of states. Whether diasporas can be part of international relations. And lastly, through looking at the protocols, I think we can learn a lot about the nature of the diaspora from a political perspective. What is the Armenian diaspora today? And more specifically, the nature of diaspora-Armenia political relations. So these are the questions that I will try to develop and address in my paper. Now, I'm sure you know about the background of the event, the protocols. In 2007, there were secret negotiations started between Armenian diplomats and Turkish diplomats. They took place, the initial 4 meetings in Bern, the Swiss capital. And after the August 2008 war in Georgia, these meetings took another dimension when Turkey was interested in openly revising its policy towards Armenia of the last 15 years, since basically April '93. And those more open negotiations led to the development of 2 documents, the 2 protocols, which were announced in, which became public in spring of last year, and eventually they were signed in Zurich in October 2009. I would argue that this event created the most important, the deepest crisis in diaspora-Armenian relations. I would argue that in the last 20 years, this was the most important kind of clash, if not of civilizations, but at least political visions between Armenia and the diaspora. One can argue about this. We can talk about it later. There's 1994, December 1994, when 11 Tashnaq activists were arrested and Tashnaq's tune was outlawed in Armenia. This was also a very important event. But I would argue that in case we look at popular mobilization against the protocols in the diaspora, especially at the moment of President Sarkisyan's visits to first Paris, where 300 people came to demonstrate against him with very harsh criticism addressed to him personally and to his policies. And then later his visit to New York, Los Angeles, 12,000 people in LA, Beirut, around 10,000 people, and no demonstration in Rostov. That's also interesting. Now, before going into the event itself, I want to give some background. Diaspora as a subject of international relations and study of in this field has gained some interest of late. Diaspora studies has taken very much interest in the last 2 decades, thanks among other things to the efforts of and the work of Khachik Tololian, who's present here, who says that there's increasingly disappearance of differences between diasporas and dispersion. And in this age of globalization, the classical definition of diaspora is collapsing, and diasporas are seen everywhere. And as a result, there's a very large interest in what diasporas are and how to study them. Now I want to use one definition given by Rogers Brubaker, a sociologist from UCLA, right, who tries to see diasporas not as identities inherited, but as actively mobilized identities in political, cultural, and other phenomena. So I think this definition of diasporas as mobilized expression of your identity is very important, and I will come back to that a bit later. Now, in international relations, there has been different ways of looking at diasporas. One is very much pushed by different agencies, including United States, USAID, basically, who tried to do some research and tried to see whether we can use diasporas as element of aid in international development. More specifically, in the case of Armenians, USAID has looked whether it can work as a link between Armenian American communities in Armenia as a way to pass knowledge, know-how, and funds to Armenia as a way to develop the country. So there's been some effort in this direction. But more often, international relations looks at diasporas as a negative force. International relations are a field where we study interstate relations, and in this aspect, diasporas kind of put their nose in a domain which is not theirs. They are often described as extreme forces. They have extreme nationalist positions, whether it's Armenian diaspora or Kosovo Albanian diaspora or others. And they are also seen as forces not ready to integrate within the political framework of the countries they adopted, the countries they immigrated, and they still insist on having an independent vision and pushing it through lobbies. I put quote unquote in quotations. So all this is seen in international relations as a negative force. A third element here is that when we look at the way the Armenian diaspora is studied, very often both scholars as well as journalists and politicians very often over-exaggerate, I would say, the importance of Armenian diaspora and its impact on Armenia and its policies. For example, in my paper, I quote one paper written by two scholars who basically see the 98 palace coup in Yerevan as the work of rich Armenian diaspora, which is, those of us who followed the history know that it's over exaggeration. So we have, and there are many declarations of Azeri, Turkish, other politicians who try to see the Armenian diaspora as very influential and very negative force in diplomatic relations between Armenia and its neighboring countries. Now I want to develop a bit my sense of diaspora Armenian political culture. There has been lots of things said about this, especially after the genocide and early Cold War period. I would say that it's interesting to see how Armenian diaspora policies in the 60s evolved into looking at the question of genocide recognition as a central issue. Basically, the construction can be put in such a way that our historical enemy is Turkey. The force that protected Armenia historically is Russia. Whether Russia is communist or Tsarist or whatever is not important. What is important that Armenia, for its own survival, should be in harmony with Russia, so that we are not exposed to this eternal enemy Turkey, which is genocidal and can destroy Armenia. So even Tashnak Tsytun, which initially was very much anti-Soviet, after the 60s moved slowly into this direction. Now here I will venture into going and trying to define the dynamic diaspora identity as evolving around this. What makes an Armenian different from other identities? In pre-modern times, it was largely defined by religion. An Armenian was someone who went to Armenian church rather than to Georgian Orthodox Church, or rather than the Alewi in the next village, or the Sunni Muslim Kurd in the next mountain. What defined an Armenian was the church. In modern times, with the decrease of church influence and the rise of political parties, national identities, nationalism, language became more and more important, which was not the case before. Now today, in our times, church is not as important as before. Language is not as important as before. I would say that in our times, what defines diaspora and Armenian identity is this political mobilization around the demand of genocide recognition. Now we can discuss about this. It's quite a risky terrain I'm going into, but this is the definition I'm trying to give, and this fits Brubaker's definition, but also it fits my analysis of why the protocols created such a strong clash. And I would not even try to imagine the day when Turkey eventually recognizes the Armenian genocide, because the power, the strength, and the interest of mobilization around this issue will decrease, and I don't know whether Armenian identity has other sources upon which it can base itself to evolve and perpetuate in the diaspora. And this very much explains why in 1988, when there was such a strong mobilization in Armenia, diasporan parties, including Tashnak Tsytsyun, came out against it, because this clashed with its own identity more than its own policies. It was so deep, and it stays so deep up to today, because it clashed against this fear that in case we lose the protector, we will be exposed against the enemy. A couple of words about Armenia and its policies towards the diaspora, towards the genocide issue, and Armenia-Turkey relations. I mean, these are very complex issues, and I have only a few minutes to cover it. So just some ideas I want to put forward. First, Armenia went through a revolution in the late 80s, including not just a social revolution, which was the case, but also a political one. And this political revolution basically said that we want to rebel against this definition that we need Russian protection to survive. And as a result, there was a whole revision of the way Armenian-Russian history was narrated in the pre-1988 period. And there was much revision about this. Moreover, at the time, the Armenian national movement, very faster than other forces, felt that the Soviet Union was collapsing, and we need to develop our own independent policies, structures, so that we solve our problems. And in case we compare Armenia with Azerbaijan, the conditions are very different, but Azerbaijan was late in doing that, and as a result, Armenia was better positioned for the Karabakh struggle to come. And it's very important to understand the outcome of the Karabakh war. In any case, there was this very deep revision of Armenian history and Armenian-Russian relations, but also Armenian-Turkish relations. And the new Armenian leadership that came to power was ready to normalize relations without preconditions. Yet the evolution of the Karabakh conflict was the major cause so that Armenia-Turkey relations are not normalized. And Armenia goes back to its previous positions and seek a strong alliance with Russia from different positions, but still we have a repetition of the setup of the geopolitical reality in the South Caucasus, in spite of the will of the new group coming to power in Yerevan. So we have a first period under President Tepetosyan, where Armenia is trying to normalize relations with Turkey, but Turkey, especially after the Kelbajar operation in April 1993, joining Azerbaijan to impose a blockade on Armenia and say that we open borders once Armenian forces go out of Kelbajar and the other territories, Azerbaijani territories around Karabakh, occupied by Armenian forces. This was the initial precondition of Ankara for opening the border. After the second president came to power, Robert Kocharian, as Asmed already mentioned, the issue of the genocide recognition was declared to be a cornerstone of Armenian foreign policy. This makes sense from Armenian standpoint, in case you look at the previous experience where Armenia tried to normalize relations and didn't get what it wanted. So the reaction is to take a step back and more radical positions, and let's try to see what happens now. So in the 10 years period of Robert Kocharian in power, there was much more cooperation between official Yerevan and its diplomacy and Armenian groups in North America, in Europe, and other places, trying to push for official recognition of the international community of the reality of the Armenian genocide. Also, this didn't kind of change anything in the reality of South Caucasus geopolitics. We have the third president coming to power, Serge Sarkisyan, who's saying we tried to push Turkey, we tried to push for recognition of the genocide, and it didn't give any results. Let's try to push for normalization. As I said initially, the negotiations, the secret negotiations started even before him. They started under in 2007 when Robert Kocharian was the president and Vartan Oskanian was the foreign minister. Yet it took a new force because of different reasons. The war in Georgia, the new team coming to power in Turkey, and also trying to revise their own identity and foreign policy and history, creating conditions where Armenia-Turkey relations can be revised. Now, it was in these conditions that the protocols were elaborated, and there we see that Yerevan didn't very much consult with Armenian diasporan structures before elaborating the protocols. And once the protocols were public, there was a very strong reaction from the diaspora, from Tashnak Sütyun, from other organizations as well. I should also underline that there were also diaspora and Armenian parties and associations which were for the protocols and did not criticize Armenian foreign policy, including the Ramgavar Sütyun, including AGBU and others. But the overwhelming kind of mood was very much critical. And there was some mobilization in Armenia as well. But it's very interesting in case we see who was vocal against the protocols in Armenia. And there we see basically Tashnak Sütyun, especially those elements of Tashnak Sütyun who originally are from the diaspora. For example, Giro Manoyan, one of the leaders of the party, he was very much quoted in the media, and he's not originally, he's not born and raised in Armenia, but he comes from the diaspora. We have the first foreign minister of Armenia, Rafi Ovanesyan, very much critical of the protocols, also a diaspora Armenian personality. We have Vartan Oskanian, very vocal against the protocols, although the negotiations started under his terms, when he was the foreign minister, but still very vocal. And we see that in other circles in Armenia, there's no much mobilization around this issue. Why is this so? Why do we have differences in position between the Armenia kind of political culture and the diaspora political culture? I'd say one of the reasons is that for the experience of an Armenian from Armenia, genocide is a very important element, but it's not the only element in the construction of their political consciousness. After the genocide, there's the Soviet history, the Sovietization period. There's the Second World War, very important element. There's many other elements, but the crucial element which makes the contemporary identity of Armenians is the 1988 Karabakh movement, which is the cornerstone of Armenia's independence. And what Armenia was gaining from the protocols was exactly to separate the Armenia-Turkey relations, the opening of the border with Turkey, from the question of Karabakh. And I think in my interviews in the summer and autumn 2009 in Yerevan, this was very much underlined by many people, including Arman Giragosyan, who was the chief negotiator, he was underlining, I mean, he told me that this is our achievement in the protocols. This is the important thing for us. We are not revising our policies, it's Turkey revising its policies, which for 15 years insisted on linking these two issues, and in the protocols we are separating them. Now, many other people, including Jiro Manoyan, didn't see that the protocols separated these two issues. He saw that the protocols were indirectly linking them, plus the different declarations of the Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan were openly linking the protocols with the Karabakh issue. It's very important to see that Taşnak Sütun in spring 2009 left the coalition government to protest against the protocols, and as Asmet also mentioned, that it's interesting that it was this event and not other events, especially the 2008 February elections and 2008 March clashes and the suppression of the demonstrations of the opposition, which were kind of a trigger for Taşnak Sütun to leave the government. So it's not an interior policy issue, rather than it's the very identity-linked issue of debating Armenian history with Turkey, which was a point that Taşnak Sütun could not accept and left the coalition government. Now to conclude, we see that there's two very different cultures which creates policies between Armenia and the diaspora. In my interviews, someone said maybe what's missing in Armenia is diasporan lobbying, so that diasporan forces lobby for their own interests and become more vocal in Yerevan, so that Armenian authorities. You can use lobby in this case. Yes, okay, yeah, it's legal. So that Armenian government hears more about Armenian diasporan concerns. This was quite interesting. So we have very different cultures and very different cornerstones on which policies are built, and there's on the one hand misunderstanding. For the elaboration of the protocols, there was no effort by Yerevan to consult the diaspora. It's also interesting that the president felt obliged to make a tour and visiting different important diasporan communities to listen to them, although this listening act could not change even a comma in the protocols. It's not to underestimate the effort of visiting, because he knew that he was going to be heavily criticized and opposed, but still he took the act. Now to conclude, I would say that we see that mobilized diasporan groups can become actors in international policies, as long as there are states giving space and being interested in their work. So when we see that there's collaboration and a common interest between Yerevan foreign policy and diaspora mobilization, we see that this cooperation becomes very influential in international relations. And when there's a contradiction between these two visions and interests, we see that diasporan voices cannot become as influential and strong, and eventually Yerevan has to decide out of its own interests, its own foreign policy. Thank you very much.